And 3, 2, 1. Can you hold the paper just a little higher?
Today,
There you go.
today is June 28th, 2024. We are interviewing Raymond Pollock. My name is Esther Finder. Mr. Pollock is in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. I am in Henderson, Nevada, in the United States, and the language will be English.
3, 2, 1.
Thank you for speaking with us today. What is your name, sir, and can you please spell it?
My name is Raymond Joseph Pollock, RaymondJoseph. Last name is Pollak.
And what was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Raymond Joseph Roth, Roth.
Where were you born?
I was born in Limoges, France.
Has your family lived in France for many generations?
Not at all. My mother was was deported to a concentration camp in the south of France named Gurs. That's how I happened to wind up being born in that area, which is part of my story.
Okay, well, we'll go right to that in a minute. When were you born?
February 16th, 1943.
And how old are you now?
81 years old.
Let's start with your father. What was his name?
His name was Arthur Turl, known as Turl, Trul, Schnierer. Did you want me to spell it? Schnierer.
Do you know where he was born?
He was born in Vienna, Austria.
When did he go to France and why?
He went to France in 1939 when he had been active in the anti-fascist movement, was a secretary for various related organizations. When the Anschluss occurred and Nazi Germany took over Austria, he had to leave Vienna, and he wound up in Belgium. When the Nazis invaded Belgium in 1939, 1940, he was actually captured by the Nazis and was deported to France, various concentration camps in France, and wound up in Gurs, which is a concentration camp in the south of France, extreme south of France, and there he met my mother.
What do you know about his family?
Well, his mother had 6 sisters. They came from a religious family who lived in a village in Hungary, somewhere West Hungary, and where they had been Jews for generations. So I can trace back my family about 6 generations.
What work does your father do?
Well, my father, as I explained, first of all, was very young when, obviously, when the war was started. So he, again, was part of the Nuremberg laws when Nazi Germany took over Austria, and obviously couldn't continue his education beyond 15 years old. But he basically, I would say that he was a writer of political essays, political articles, and anti-fascist articles. He actually turned out to be, as most of his work turned out to be, as a resistance fighter with the French resistance and working for basically the anti-Nazi organization that he worked for in Vienna.
Do you know the name of the organization?
It was the Communist Party in Vienna.
What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Henrietta, known as Henny Elter, E-L-T-E-R.
And you told us a little bit about her background. Can you maybe elaborate a
Yes,
little bit more?
well, she was born in Mannheim, Germany, in 1920, June 6, 1920, and actually had five brothers and sisters, and her parents were actually Polish refugees, Jewish refugees from Poland, and actually my grandmother was born in Oswiki, which became known as Auschwitz, and which I'll talk a little bit later about her fate there. But her parents, my mother's parents, he was a cobbler, a shoemaker. She actually she was a brush salesman, a soap salesman, but that's after, and they were very poor. In fact, they were so poor that one of the youngest boys was sent to a boys' home. And in 1933, my grandfather left the family to try to find work in Italy, and he never returned. And to this day, we don't know really what happened to him. We think he maybe even have been one of the ships trying to get to Palestine, which may have been sunk by the British, or he simply was, again, put in a concentration camp in Italy and simply, and obviously didn't survive. So the point is that the family was extremely poor, and and they managed to survive under very difficult circumstances until, unfortunately, the Nazis decided to deport all of the Jews from Mannheim, which was the Baden region, to Gurs. This was actually in 1941, before the final solution, and the Nazis simply at this point wanted to remove all the Jews they could from Germany, and they picked Gurs, which was in the extreme south of France near the Pyrenees, because it would have been a shipping port to Madagascar, where the Nazis at one point had thought about sending Jews, an island off the coast, the Atlantic coast. Obviously, that didn't happen.
Can you tell us the work that she did?
Well, my mother, again, was a victim of, obviously, of the Nazis and the Nuremberg laws, and had to leave school at 15, so she never really got an education. She did had worked pretty much as a kind of a child aid worker, and a kitchen aid worker, if I can put it that way. And she tried to find work wherever she could. Obviously, she had no real education and no training. That sort of came in play when she was deported in Gurs, which I'll talk a little bit about.
You started to address this, but I'm wondering if you could maybe fill in any missing pieces to this question. What do you know about what was happening in France around the time you were born?
Well, a good deal. France had been conquered by the Nazis in 1940-41, and the country was initially divided into two zones, an occupied zone and a free unoccupied zone, which was in the south of France and it became known as the Vichy regime. By 1942, the Nazis had decided to take over the whole country. But what happened as a result of that, there was more opportunity for autonomy in the south of France, and there was a good deal more resistance activity against the Germans. The Nazis also indicated that they wanted the south of France to be relatively free of conflict because they wanted to use that area for their soldiers to recuperate. So in many ways, and that's kind of my theme about my whole life, is that I was very lucky to have been born in that area, because otherwise, if I'd been born anywhere else in Europe, I probably would not have survived.
How did your parents meet?
My mother, as I said, in 1941, and her mother were deported to Gurs, and there she met my father, and it seems that he actually came a little later. As I mentioned earlier, that he had been sent to various concentration camps in France and wound up in Gurs. In Gurs, he was in charge of food distribution, and actually told my mother, and so they met there, and he actually told my mother at one point to be the last to eat from the food kettle, the communal food kettle, because the food would be more nutritious at the bottom of the kettle. And he is credited for having saved numerous lives through his actions.
What do you know about the nature of their relationship?
Well, as a matter of fact, I just recently had translated some of his letters in which he talked about meeting my mother and very fondly, and that he kind of was worried about how the relationship would be seen, but it was real. Although he had a relationship with another woman in Austria, and he considered that woman to be kind of his wife, but he deeply cared about my mother, and he was overjoyed when he found out that he had a child.
3, 2, 1.
Okay, we are back. I had asked you about the nature of your parents' relationship. Can you tell us what was happening to your parents in the months before your birth?
Well, let me go back a little bit in terms of how I was able to sort of be born in the first place and survive, and my mother and I survived. My parents were selected for a work training program by a very famous French priest who was born Jewish, and you have to remember that the whole area around Gurs and that whole region was very anti-Nazi and very sympathetic with heavy resistance. And we all know the famous stories of the whole villages in near that area that actually took in 3,500 Jews and children and adults and saved them through their actions. So in a way, this action by this French priest was part of this movement And then what they're going to do is about 20 or so young people, because my parents were obviously young at that time, and we're going to take them to be trained for a trade, to have a trade. About, as I mentioned earlier, by 1942, the Nazis really took over the Vichy regime. The South, the unoccupied zone became an occupied zone. It was never heavily policed as the North was, but nevertheless, what happened is obviously there was a change of mind about allowing these young Jews to be free, and they were recaptured by the French police and sent to another concentration camp called Le Mille. Now, I want to make the point that these concentration camps were not death camps. You didn't have uniforms, first of all. You wore your own clothes. You could write letters to relatives and friends. And if you got a visa to a country that would accept you, you could leave. This was true for Gurs and for Le Mille. But in 1942, the Nazis came up with the final solution and started to liquidate the concentration camps. By the way, according to my research, the Nazis had established up to several thousands concentration camps. There were 6 death camps that were exclusively dedicated to the genocide and the murder of Jews and other, or what the Nazis called undesirables. But there were thousands, literally thousands of these concentration camps, and Gurs and Le Mille were just 2 of them. And if you could get out, they would let you go. Unfortunately, as one famous person said, once you were Le Mille or Le Gurs, if you had a choice between a ship to the United States or a train to Auschwitz. And unfortunately, my grandmother was not able, my mother's mother was not able to escape from Gurs, and did wind up being transported to Auschwitz, which was the town that she was born in, named Auschwitz, and she was murdered there. So, but to go back to my parents' stories, they actually were then recaptured from the work-study program, wherever in that area, and sent to Le Mille. My father had connections with the resistance, and he was informed that he and my mother, his name would be called to be put on a train to be transported to Auschwitz. When their names were called, they did not respond, and actually managed to escape by going over the barbed wire. From that point, they actually destroyed all of their present identification papers and went to Marseille, where they were able to find connections with the resistance, and my father was provided with different identification paper, ration cards, and my mother as well, and her name was changed to Mary Louise Roth. From there, my father was actually called to go to the north of France, the Pas-de-Calais region, where he was active as a resistance fighter and trying to obtain documentation, documents related to the fortifications in that area, because the Nazis thought that the Allies would invade in the Pas-de-Calais region. They actually wound up invading further south in Normandy. But he was able to provide my mother with, as I said, new identification paper, ration cards, and as a result, she was able to survive and meet other persons in the same circumstances, and actually was in Lyon for a while, which was sort of the capital of central France, and was also where the infamous Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie was basically located. So it was a very dangerous place. My mother was a very brave person and very alert, if I can put it that way. And she tells of being stopped numerous times by the French police, and she would tell them, I have a baby at home, and if you capture me, if you take me in, there'll be nobody to take care of her. At one point, I was just reading her memoirs again, and she said that she was actually arrested by the French police, and they said, well, you don't sound French, you sound German, and you're probably Jewish. And she said, well, if you don't believe me, take me to the station, and we'll settle it there. They actually said, you can go, just don't let us see you again. So this was kind of the hallmark of my mother in terms of her bravery and quick-wittedness. And as I'll probably say later, she says that I saved her life, but obviously she saved my life many times over. So, and I'm not sure exactly how she wound up from Lyon to Limoges. Obviously, by the time she was in Lyon, she was pregnant. According to memoirs, she was helped by numerous people that she met, including, and she worked as, a child worker, an aid worker, and the Red Cross in particular was very helpful. When she wound up in a hospital for the birth of her child, they never asked whether she was Jewish. They took care of her, and somehow she was able to survive and manage to escape the Nazis.
You may not know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you know if your parents had thought to stay together instead of separating?
I think I mentioned earlier that my father was very conflicted because he already had a relationship with another woman in Vienna, and he considered that woman to be his wife, although he was not married. And as you can imagine, due to the circumstances, he never was able to marry my mother. So I do understand that he was aware of my birth, was very happy about having a child, and saw me a few times. But for the most part, he was away from my mother. She remained in kind of the central South France, and he was actively working in the resistance in the Pas-de-Calais region. And I even have an article, there's even a book from another Austrian Jew who was also active in the resistance, who talks about providing my father with blueprints from the fortifications of the Pas-de-Calais. Obviously, if my father had been caught with those papers, he would have been shot on the spot.
Where and if you can explain the circumstances, where along the way were you born? What was going on when you made your appearance?
Well, it's kind of a remarkable story because from Lyon to Limoges is about 250 miles. So I just did the research. And somehow, as I said, going from place to place, She was accepted by people who obviously knew that she was Jewish, and essentially sheltered her, whether it was in a hospital or in a child care place, orphanages, and of course those places could always use an extra hand. So she just managed to kind of wander from place to place, and in Limoges happened to be where she gave birth to me.
Considering the circumstances, were you circumcised?
No, actually, no. I was not circumcised at that time. And in fact, I was circumcised when I was 9 years old in Israel. And I can remember saying, Safimal, which means it hurts. So, but yes, in fact, I didn't know I was Jewish until I was 7 or 8 years old.
During this time that your mother was alone with you, was your father able to help her in any way?
Yes, he helped her a great deal. As I said, he provided her with identification papers, ration cards. He was able to send her fruit, what she mentions at one point. He provided her with, I think, a baby carriage, clothes for me. I'm not sure how he managed that, but apparently he helped out a great deal, as much as he could.
Can you tell us how both of your parents, you can do whichever parent first that you want, both of them got through the war? What happened next?
Well, my mother was really able to survive with the help of the people in that region of France. As I mentioned, it was very sympathetic, very anti-Nazi, very sympathetic to the Free French movement, and very sympathetic to resistance fighters, if I can put it that way, and very sympathetic to the refugees, whether they were Jewish or not. There was kind of a history of standing up to the central government in that area, and so it kind of helped foster kind of atmosphere of not being actively involved in seeking out Jews and turning them to the Gestapo. In fact, it was the reverse. There was an atmosphere of actively trying to support and hide and shelter Jews and probably other refugees as well. So she was lucky, and obviously, as I said, when she was stopped by the police a number of times, she would say, well, I have a baby to take care of, and if you take me in, who's going to do that? Plus, her very way of kind of bluffing the police and kind of challenging them worked. And she had done that during Kristallnacht. And when the Nazi thugs came into the apartment, she actually stood up to them and said, well, you can go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and break everything you can? You've already done everything. You've already damaged everything. And they just left. So as I said, she was a terrifically courageous person. My father's story has, unfortunately, a different ending. So the point is that my mother was able to survive, and in 1944, that region, towards the end of 1944, the region was liberated by the Free French Army. So obviously, at that point, my mother had survived. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. She actually had more trouble surviving physically, not physically, but through obtaining food and be able to survive, because her because my father was not around anymore. His story is in 1944, when France was liberated, he was ordered back to Vienna to continue the work, the anti-fascist work that he had been doing. Somebody gave him up to the Gestapo, and he was captured and sent to Auschwitz. And in fact, his capture papers show a red dot, which indicates that he was a flight risk and that he probably should not be allowed to survive. However, he did survive Auschwitz and was transferred to Buchenwald, and this was in 1945. And Buchenwald, he was actually, but he was by then in a very terrible shape and very ill. And in 1945, when Buchenwald was liberated by the U.S. Army, he was actually selected to be one of 4 Austrian inmates to represent other Austrian prisoners who wanted to go back to Vienna. Unfortunately, shortly after his liberation, as part of his liberation, he was very ill and unfortunately succumbed of his illness and did not survive.
Do you know how long he was in those camps, Auschwitz and the next one?
Well, he was in Gurs probably over a year, maybe close to 2 years, and Auschwitz, 44 to 45, about the whole total, about a year and a half. Because as soon as he went back to Vienna, he was captured, sent to Auschwitz, and then eventually transferred to Buchenwald. So I think the total amount of time was probably maybe a year or maybe less. But there's documentation that he was tortured and subject to terrible treatment.
How did you and your mother find out about his fate? How did you first find out?
I found out through my aunt, I guess. His sister survived the war, and my mother told me. I mean, basically, she told me her story, and I'm not. My mother doesn't say exactly how she was informed, but I believe that it would be my father's sister or a cousin that would have informed her.
I want to go back to something you said a moment ago. You were talking about your mother's survival, and you talked about the history of standing up to the central government. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes. That area was actually composed. There were a large number of Huguenots, which are French Protestants, and the French Catholics at various points organized essentially massacres of the Huguenots, and there's a very famous episode in the history of France. It's the St. Bartholomew's massacre, where thousands of Huguenots and Protestants were massacred. And it's a very famous story about Henry IV, who became king and kind of made peace. But it was a horrible situation, and many of those people in that area near the central France were Huguenots, and therefore had a history of resisting, obviously, the French authority, the Catholic Church, and trying to survive. And in fact, they would take Jewish refugees in 1940, 1942 through to Switzerland, to escape the Nazis using the same routes that their ancestors had followed years before to try to escape the Catholics.
You had talked about some members of your family and their fates. Can you share any other family members, what happened to them, anything you might know about them?
One brother, out of my mother's brothers and sisters, 5 brothers and sisters, one brother, and the brother who had to be sent to a boys' camp was actually sent to Sachsenhausen, and where he died by either walking to the wire, which was electrocuted, or was shot. So we're not sure which one. My other 4 brothers and sisters, my mother's 4 brothers and sisters were actually able, after Kristallnacht, they certainly understood that it wasn't safe for Jews. They managed to go to Palestine. Out of my father's family, practically none of my grandmother's sisters survived. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather and grandmother went back to their village in Hungary, and towards the end of the war were given up and eventually captured by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz, where they perished. And I believe that's the fate of all of my paternal grandmother's relatives as well. I think one cousin that I know survived, and obviously my father's sister survived as well, because she had gone to Britain early on in 1938 or so.
What steps did your mom take to rebuild her life after the war?
Well, as I said, the irony was that after the war, she had, in a way, a more difficult time in surviving because she didn't have any means of support. But she tells of meeting a Jewish family in Lyon who happened to own a sewing machine operation or factory or semi-factory. And they were able to train her to be a sewing machine operator and give her a job. So she wound up in Paris, and as I said, was able to work as a sewing machine operator and so make a living. In the meantime, she had put me in an orphanage, basically, because she couldn't take care of me. And in Paris, so that would be in 1947, 1946, 1947, she met my stepfather and married him in 1949. And in 1949, I believe, I'm sorry, I have to take that back. I think she got married earlier because my brother was born in 1949, and I was able to rejoin the family then at that time. As an aside, life was very difficult. They both my mother and my stepfather were obviously not able to have an education. And as I said, my mother was a sewing machine operator. My stepfather actually sold surplus army clothes, and it was a very difficult time for both of them. And the apartment, when I joined them, they lived in an apartment in Paris. The apartment had no running water, a coal stove for heat and for cooking, and the toilet, there was one toilet at the bottom of the apartment building, and they lived on the 4th floor. So, and the water was on the 3rd floor. So to get water, my mother had to go to the 3rd floor and bring it back to the apartment, and to get coal for the stove, she had to go to another building, was the same building, but if you know anything about the Parisian buildings, they have different kind of branches, I guess you can say. And she had to go from one area to another area to get coal, and this was almost a daily thing. To this day, I don't know how she survived. Plus having to take care of a baby and me as well. So it was very, very difficult. We did move to a better apartment before we left for the United States.
We're not ready to leave.
Yes.
The United States just yet. You mentioned your mother married this. Was he a survivor? And can you tell us about his story?
Yes. Well, he was from Romania and had come to Paris. His father died apparently in World War II, in World War One. We're not sure about the fate of his mother, but he came to Paris. His aunt had been in Paris, had emigrated from Romania to Paris earlier, and he came to Paris to be with his aunt. She mistreated him, but the main point of his story that at 18, he was told by the French police that either you join the French Foreign Legion or we will send you back to Romania. So he joined the French Foreign Legion, and he was with the French Foreign Legion for 7 years. Now, the interesting thing about the French Foreign Legion is that, again, it was kind of divided into two separate, I guess, armies. One which supported the Nazis, and another part, another segment that supported the Free French kind of government that was active in London. So I'm not sure exactly which part my stepfather belonged to, but he tells of essentially being made a prisoner of the Italians and escaping them. So that would make him part of the Free French Army of the French Foreign Legion.
So far, we've talked about things that happened to other people. Let me ask you, what are some of your earliest memories? Are any of them from the war years?
No, not really. I was told that obviously my birth was a welcome occasion for both my mother and father, even though the difficult circumstances, and that she had a circle of friends and people who were in the same position, and they kind of dotted on me as a baby, and so that I was a source of comfort. But I don't remember any of the war years at all. I do remember being the children's home I was sent to, the orphanage I was sent to, and remember that if I didn't want to eat the food, they would kind of leave it for the next day. So I learned to eat what was on my plate, but I was not mistreated, I think overall I think I was treated well. There is a story that the orphanage was housed in a former house of Empress Josephine, Napoleon Bonaparte's wife, and it was called Malmaison, which means bed house, but it was not a bed house to me.
Before we move on, is there anything else that you haven't shared with us about the war that you'd like to say now?
Well, I mean, as I keep on saying, my mother and I were very lucky to actually have been in the area that we were in during the war, and that she was able to survive Gurs because she had been used to hardships. She had been used to not having enough food and having to live under certain different circumstances. The Jews and others, well, the Jews primarily from Gurs who had been better off, frankly died at a much higher rate because they were not used to the hardships. So it's an irony and a grace in the fact that she was from a poor family and had been used to the hardships, and it enabled her to survive the conditions at Gurs, which were pretty horrible. There's even a story about somebody witnessing an elderly Jewish woman falling down in the mud at Gurs and not be able to get up and die. It was a horrible place to be in. As I said, it was not a death camp, but it was, you can imagine being in that area and near the mountains. It was terribly hot in the summer, terribly cold in the winter, and it rained all the time. And of course, it was, simply mud roads. I mean, there was obviously no roads, to speak of. So, again, she was lucky to have been able to survive it, lucky to be able to chosen to leave, to be taken out of Gurs, and lucky that she met my father, and that they were able to escape, and that he was able to provide for her through his connections with the French resistance.
What do you remember about starting school?
Well, I liked school very much, and I was a good student. So those are some of my better memories. I remember having to learn to write using graph paper, so my handwriting was very was spectacular, very very nice, and you learn to write, of course, slant. It was very rigorous, but I always placed one or third on top of my class every month. So I think I really liked school, and also the schools in those days also sort of provided a number of services. They would take us to the dentist. They would take us to the bathhouse. They would provide for meals. I remember eating my dinners in school sometimes, and they would also provide for experiences to go out into the countryside. So I have very pleasant memories of the schools in France and Paris.
Did you experience any anti-Semitism in the immediate aftermath of the war?
Well, no. Again, our name is not necessarily Jewish per se. And as I said, I didn't know I was Jewish until I was probably 6, 7, maybe 8 years old. So we didn't live in a primarily Jewish area, or there was not. Obviously, there were. So I have to say that in my whole life, I have experienced very few anti-Semitic incidents because I guess I don't have a name that's necessarily typically Jewish, and so I, for whatever reason, I was fortunate that way. My wife, who was born in the United States in Bridgeport, Connecticut, experienced a great deal of anti-Semitism when she was growing up.
Did your mother and her new husband want to stay in France?
No, they did not, and they tried to immigrate to the United States as soon as they could. Again, another irony is that under my stepfather's nationality, which was Romanian, the quota was very, very low, and he couldn't get a visa. It was not until my mother decided to use her status as a German born, as German born, that they were able to get visas. So I'm not sure how that happened, because the Nazis had basically made all Jews non-citizens. But I guess the United States government counted her place of birth, and they were able to get a visa to come to the United States. Again, as an aside to my story, my wife, I actually met my wife through the family, because my wife's father and my stepfather were first cousins, and her father actually sponsored us to come to the United States. Obviously, I'm not related to my wife, but that's kind of how we met in the first place, and how I was able to get to the United States.
So when were they able to leave France? And
in 1953. In 1953, and we first came. We came not through Ellis Island, because that sort of was over, but through the port of Manhattan. I guess East 53rd, something, West 53rd, I guess, something like that. And we actually stayed at the highest. The Hebrew Aid Association actually put us up in their building, which was right off 14th Street and Astor Place in Manhattan. Subsequently, we wound up moving to Williamsburg, and we were there about 6 months or so, and then we moved to East New York in Brooklyn, where I guess from 13 to 17, where I lived from 13 to 17 years old, and at 17 we moved to Far Rockaway, which is in Queens, Manhattan, New York.
what were your expectations of the United States before you got here? And then following up, what were your first impressions when you got here?
Well, I had no expectations. I didn't necessarily want to leave France. I thought everything was French, Colgate, Ford. I mean, whenever I saw a name, Palmolive, they have French sounds, so I thought they were French. I had my first cereal on the ship coming here, which I liked, and I obviously didn't have much choice about coming to this country, but I think, and when my mother, the second day I was here at Highest, took me to school, which I remember being in that same area. And years later, when my daughter went to NYU, her dorm was next door, next to that street. So it's sort of an interesting connection. But I very quickly learned, they didn't know what language I spoke, so they put me a grade back. And I had to unlearn a lot of the things that I had learned in French and in France. And in fact, I would bring my French books to class and kind of contradict the lessons of my teacher, which didn't make him happy. But the French were very egocentric, to put it that way, and they claimed they invented the airplane and so on. So my book, my French book reflected all that. So I was misinformed as well. So, but within 6 months, I was speaking English fluently.
You mentioned a little while ago that you did not know you were Jewish for quite a while. And you also talked about your circumcision in Israel. How did you get to Israel? We seem to have missed.
Yes. Well,
that.
my mother had brothers and sisters, as I mentioned earlier, were able to get to Palestine. My uncles and aunt, two of my uncles and one aunt were actually in the Palestine Brigade, which was made up of Jews from Palestine, and actually fought in the War of Liberation, 1948. My mother's marriage was not a happy one. As I said, they struggled, and my stepfather had been brutalized himself, so she complained, and she complained to her brothers and sisters. They invited her in 1949 to come to Israel, and with the intent of her settling there and bringing me with her. And that's how I happened to be circumcised in 1949. May have been 1950. Probably was 1950.
You did not know you were Jewish before. How did you take this news, this revelation that you were Jewish?
Well, I mean, I remember going to church with a friend, and and being impressed by it. But when I found out I was Jewish, I simply said, "Oh, I'm Jewish." So I didn't quite know what that meant, having not really had any kind of Jewish exposure or Jewish education at that point. But I don't remember it being a difficult thing to accept.
Did you witness or experience any anti-Semitism in the United States?
Well, no. As I explained earlier, I was again lucky. My last name was not really, not necessarily Jewish, and in fact, I've met people with the same last name who were not Jewish, and we're kind of horrified that it was a Jew with that name. My last name is actually a derivation of the original name Pollack with two L's and a C, so Pollack, which was my wife's name. And when my stepfather came to Paris, they franchised his name and kind of cut the one extra L and one C out of the name. So that's how we got the name Pollack, Pollak, which actually, is a term for Polish people. That we are not. Well, my grandmother was Polish, but other than that, we're not. Not necessarily Polish. But as I said, I didn't experience much direct anti-Semitism. First of all, I lived in mostly Jewish neighborhoods as I was growing up. In Brooklyn, it was pretty heavily Jewish, and same thing in Far Rockaway. And even when I went to school, City College was, again known as being a Jewish school. So most of my life, I have been in Jewish communities, and I've experienced very few anti-Semitic incidents myself, directly.
Can you tell us about your education and the trajectory of your education?
Sure. I went to public schools, as I said, initially in Manhattan, off 14th Street and Astor Place. But as soon as we we moved to Brooklyn. I went to grade school there, and obviously junior high school in Brooklyn, high school in Brooklyn, like Thomas Jefferson, which was well known for being the school that Danny Kaye had graduated from. So again, and the area had been heavily Jewish. It just kind of started to change when we moved there. But in any case, high school was a good experience for me. I was a good student. I enjoyed school, and I did well. And because I had an 85 average or more, I was able to get into City College, the City University of New York, free, tuition free, and was able to obtain a degree in social sciences from City College, and subsequently obtained my master's in education and English from City University as well, also tuition free. So I'm very grateful for that.
Can you tell us about your professional life?
Yes, I started off being a teacher in initially 1 year in Brooklyn, and then I spent a semester in the high school that Kissinger went to in Washington Heights, which was not a good experience, but I wound up in a high school in the Bronx named Morris High School, and there I had a pretty good experience. It was heavily minority school, but it was I was able to kind of have the seniors as students, and I was able to have a good experience, but I did not feel that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing the same thing. So I left and went into management training with Chase Manhattan Bank, and then subsequently the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Management training in those days was about human relations training and teaching supervisors how to properly deal with their employees, the subordinates. So it was the thing to do in the 60s and the 70s and 80s and 70s. I spent about 4.5 years as a teacher, and subsequently about 12 to 13, 14 years as in management training. And I subsequently then, because I was being let go when there was a recession, so last hired, first fired, and I thought I wanted something a little more kind of reliable, and I went into human resources, personnel, and I became a human resources director for a large social service agency in Philadelphia, and which was the largest social service agency in Philadelphia at that time, and I was there for 29 years.
Have you spoken to family or friends or students about your childhood experiences?
Yes, I've spoken. I certainly, of course, told my children my story, but I also do Holocaust presentations primarily about my mother and father, and I've done that with the Jewish Museum in Philadelphia. I've done it in the Jewish community in South Jersey, where I live. And I've done it with the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles.
Have you been back to France, specifically to those areas of your childhood?
Yes, I went back to France when I was 20 years old, and I took my wife there about 20 years later. I showed her the apartment where I lived, which had now been turned into very expensive condominiums. Yes, the whole area of Paris became really changed dramatically. Kind of became very upscale. Yes, I did go back a couple of times.
Listening to you as you have shared your life experiences, it sounds like you've done research in addition to what you were told. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal research?
Well, yes, I did a good deal of research in terms of what was happening in France at that time, and discovered that the Nazis had, according to my research, 50,000 concentration camps established in the territories, in the countries they occupied. As I said, these were not death camps, but they were prison camps. They were detainment camps. They were prison camps. And the intent was obviously for the Nazis to liquidate all of the other Jews from Europe and all the other non-desirables, including mentally handicapped people, including the Romas, anybody, and political opponents, priests, Catholic priests, and obviously Protestant priests, anybody who protested the Nazi regime. So that was shocking to me, frankly. Not necessarily surprising, I guess, if you can put it that way. But and I subsequently tried to do research about Gurs and found out what it was. That had been a former prisoner of war camp for Spanish prisoners of the Spanish Civil War, try to find out a little bit about obviously what happened to my mother's relatives. Well, what I knew because I had met them, so I knew they mostly survived, except for the one brother. But I did not know much about my father's family, and I actually found out that my grandfather, my father's father, had not been born Jewish and had converted in order to marry my father's mother. And my aunt, my one surviving, my father's surviving sister, had actually gone to Hungary and had been over her life back to Austria a number of times and in Hungary, and actually found gravestones marked with the name Schneerer, and very large and impressive stones which indicate a certain amount of wealth. So we think that the Schneerers were actually fairly well off. And I may have a Schneerer cousin in Australia, which I may have not been in touch with, but I may do so at some point.
You had mentioned previously that you were a teacher.
Yes.
And what did you teach and for what grade level, and did that experience help you with your research on your family?
As somebody who learned English as a second language, I'm not sure. Well, I loved reading. And, of course, as I said, I became fluent very quickly. So I started off going to school at City College to be an engineer, but I found out very quickly I couldn't do the math. So I thought that I needed a job when I graduated, and I thought being a teacher would be a good occupation. And so I became an English teacher and actually had to pass the various exams. And even after 4 years as an English teacher, I became a tenured teacher. But as I said, I didn't want to do that job for the rest of my life. Did it help me do the research? Yes, I suppose, but there was no real connection between my becoming an English teacher and sort of my parents' history. It's, yeah.
I'd like to ask you just a couple questions about more recent events in the world. Your reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I'm just horrified. I think it's a book from the Nazis, pure and simple, simply occupying a territory that had not done anything to him in the name of Lebensraum. Just that he wants to reinstate the Russian Communist Empire. The socialist Soviet republics of communist Russia. Pure and simple. It's a land grab, and it's horrendous. And I agree with resisting it as much as you can. It's a shame that the American public, that a lot of the American public, including the Republican Party, don't seem to understand the need to support Ukraine and what the results will be if Russia essentially winds up conquering Ukraine. It would be a horrible, horrible disaster, and Putin will not stop there. He wants to probably regain the Baltic countries and whatever other territories that the Soviet Empire lost.
October 7th. Your thoughts on that day?
I am just horrified. It's the largest loss of life of Jews since the Holocaust. It is a stark reminder of the hate against Jews and the damage that can be done to innocent Jewish population that is not prepared. And it's just horrible. It's just horrible. I am absolutely distraught about the loss of innocent lives on both sides, but Hamas has sworn to destroy Israel. That's in its constitution, and how a country like Israel, any other country, can live next to an entity that wants to destroy it is beyond belief. So I'm not sure that Israel has any choice but to resist in every way it can, and to try to eliminate Hamas. Hamas is an existential threat to Israel.
And the rise in anti-Semitism lately?
I very much feel like there are unfortunately too many similarities to the 30s of Germany, where Jews are being made scapegoats, where Israel is being attacked on all fronts because ultimately it's a very small country, and it can be criticized and can be attacked, whereby a country like Russia that invades another innocent country without really any claim, any cause, and no one says a word. No, there's no protest, or the fact that that China is mistreating and trying to change the basic religion of millions of Muslims, or the fact that India is persecuting its Muslims. So it's just the whole thing is beyond comprehension and beyond rational thinking.
Is there anything that we have not spoken about that you want to add?
Well, Yes, I wanted to say that Germany has done a remarkable job of trying to atone for its sins, if I can put it that way. And in fact, in Mannheim, there are two things. One is, I've visited Mannheim recently with my brother, and as soon as you step out of the main train station, there is a sign pointing to Gurs with the kilometers indicated. I'm sure most young people have no clue what it refers to. But also in Mannheim, in the middle of its main street, which is equivalent to Fifth Avenue, there is a large cube, a crystal cube, that has the names of Jews that were persecuted by the Nazis, of Jews who lived in Mannheim and persecuted by the Nazis, either deported or actually were murdered by the Nazis. And the names are inscribed inside the cube, and you have to look inside the cube to make out the names. And my grandparents, my paternal grandparents' names are listed there, and my uncle's name is listed there. And it's remarkable. In addition to that, the Germans have also laying down stones, commemorative stones for Jews where they last live. And so we've had stones put down for my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents, and her uncle, and she's listed as well. There's a stone for her as well, because she was deported from Mannheim. It's remarkable, and I was recently in Budapest and went through a number of towns in Germany, small towns, and there are stones in a lot of these towns, and they talked about the fact that there were Jews living there in the 1100s, 1200s, and in 1940 they all basically disappeared. And so, but they still have, even where there is no synagogue, they have either like a diorama of what used to be the synagogue, or a plaque where the Jews were living. So I think that Germany, in a way, has done a great deal to try to remember the Jews that lived in Germany, and were either expelled or brutally murdered. And I think they've done a really good job. In fact, even Austria is doing the same thing. And as I said, I was recently in Vienna, and we had stones put down for my father, his parents, and his parents as well. And we had a ceremony there to put down the placing of the stones, and other families, Jewish families who lived there, who lived in that area of Vienna.
Are you referring to the Stoppelstein?
Yes, exactly.
Just wanted to make sure.
Yes, exactly.
My last question, sir.
Sure.
What message do you have for future viewers of this interview?
Well, first of all, remember the past, because if you don't, you're doomed to repeat it. Number two, do not hate based on religion, based on looks, based on sex, orientation, and stand up to injustice and bullying whenever you see it. And the last message is value your education. Education is a privilege and is to be valued.
Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you for letting me tell my story, my parents' story. Appreciate it very much.
In 3, 2, 1.
What are we looking at now?
You're looking at pictures of my mother as a young woman, her mother in the middle, and my mother again on the other side.
Can you give me the names, please, first and
Sure.
last?
My mother, Henrietta, Henrietta, known as Henny Pollock, Polak.
And her mother?
Her mother's name is Leah, Leie, Elter, Elter. She was
And
born.
do you know when or where these pictures were taken?
No. I assume, obviously, they were taken. My mother looks about, I guess, in the 1940s, before they were deported.
And you think this is what country?
This is in Germany.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
Can you tell us about this picture, please?
Yes, this is an actual photograph taken of a Jewish man from Mannheim being deported to Gurs in 1940. This is kind of a candid shot and not an official photograph by any means. That poor man had a store in Mannheim, which was later taken over by a Kurdish family, but he was subsequently shipped to Auschwitz, and where he was murdered.
And again, what country?
Germany, I'm sorry.
Thank
He
you.
was from Mannheim,
Thank
Germany.
you. Mm-hmm.
3, 2, 1.
And can you tell us about this picture, please?
Yes, this is a photograph, an aerial photograph of Gurs that was originally built to house Republican refugees from the Spanish Civil War. Actually, they were Spanish prisoners of the Spanish Civil War.
And when was this taken?
This was taken probably in 1938, something like that. 39.
And the country?
France.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
And what's happening in this picture?
This is an actual photograph, again, taken in 1941 of a street, basically a street, if I can call it, of Gurs. And obviously it had rain, and it was, just mud, just kind of a swamp almost. We do have an account of an eyewitness at Gurs who saw an elderly woman, very much like this. Well, they may not be, probably is not the same woman, but who fell down in the mud, face down, and was unable to get up and died.
And the country?
This is Gurs, France.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
Can you please tell us what are we looking at here?
You're looking at the communal food kettle in Gurs, in Camp Gurs in 1941. My father was in charge of food distribution and told my mother to be the last to eat because the most nutritious food was on the bottom of the kettle.
And there's a date on this. What country, please?
France. This is 1941, France.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
And can you please tell us about this picture?
Yes, this shows the concentration camp called Les Milles, that my mother and father were subsequently sent to after they escaped, after they were taken out of Gurs. It was not, as I mentioned, not a death camp. It was an internment camp, and you could leave if you could get papers and visas to leave. But if not, by 1942, when the Nazis had kind of developed a final solution, you were then shipped from Les Milles basically to Auschwitz, which was the nearest death camp.
And what country?
I'm sorry, Les Milles is in France, near Marseille in the south of France.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
Who is this?
This is my father, Arthur Turl Schneer, born June 6, 1913.
And do you know when and where this picture was taken?
I really don't. I can only guess that it was probably taken in Vienna in happier times, probably 1930, maybe he's a bit older there. Maybe when he returned back to Vienna before he was captured by the Gestapo.
Three, two, one.
And who are these people?
These are a group of 8 workers in the Gurs concentration camp, and my father is the third person in the white pants from the left. As I said, he was in charge of food distribution and quite well known for helping people survive the camp.
Do you know when this was taken?
I would say 1941, probably 1941. Early
And
1942.
what country?
France.
Okay. And you gave your father's name, first and last name?
Yeah, Arthur Schneer.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
And please tell us about this.
This is a caricature of my father holding up a barrack of Gurs concentration camp, and it says Churl, which was his nickname, saying, "on which the whole burden rests." So, as I said, he was quite well known for his activities in the camp, which helped a number of people survive.
Okay, and the name and location, what country of the camp?
Again, Churl, Arthur Schneer, and Gurs concentration camp, France.
Okay, and did you say what year you think this might
1941, early
be?
42.
And I'm sorry.
42, early 1942, late 1941, early 1942.
And do you know who drew it?
Yes, she was a nurse who worked with him, or he worked with her, helping in the camp.
I don't suppose you know her name.
Yeah, I have her name somewhere, but I'm not at the tip of my not on the tip of my not on the tip of my mouth, not on the tip of my tongue.
Okay.
Liz something. Yeah. Liz something. Lisbeth something.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
What is this that we're looking at now?
A photograph of the actual document, arrest record of my father, with his name apparently misspelled, but from Auschwitz, and it shows a red dot, which means that he was an escape risk, and also kind of told the Gestapo or the guards that he was to be killed.
And can you give us his full name?
Arthur Turl Schnierer. It's spelled the same spelling as listed, but with an N instead of an M.
I see.
Yeah, they made that mistake in a number of those documents, but it is him because it's the same birth date, the first name, so there's no question that it's the same person. It's my father.
Yeah, and it says Vienna. Queen.
Yes, Vienna, and his birth date is correct. So,
is there anything else you want to tell us about this?
that's about all I know.
Okay, thank you.
And 3, 2, 1.
Can you please tell us about this?
Yes, this is my father's arrest record in Buchenwald with his name spelled correctly.
And there's a date on here?
Does look like, 1944.
And the post-it note?
Well, the post-it note simply says that it's his Buchenwald record, my father's Buchenwald record.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about this?
No, that's all.
How did you get this document? Or obviously this is a copy, but how did you get it?
The National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The arrest records come from there.
Thank you. You'll be able to point out which one he is without using your finger?
Well, no. I can tell you where he is, though.
Okay. Well, as soon as we're ready to go.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1.
Can you please tell us about this picture?
This is a photograph of inmates in Buchenwald at the liberation by the United States Army. My father is in the back, the very, I don't know if you can make it out, on the left side, the last figure in the background. And this kind of shows their condition at the time of their liberation.
And your father's name?
Arthur Turl Schnierer. And this is the liberation of Buchenwald. Buchenwald is in Germany.
And this would have been in what, 1945?
1945, correct.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1.
And please, what are we looking at now?
You're looking at the special section in the Central Viennese Cemetery where my father is buried. Special section dedicated to victims of Nazism. And the pictures of my father's grave is on the right-hand side with a small stone. Arthur Turl Schnierer, and those are pictures of my two daughters a few years ago.
Can you give us their names?
Yes, my oldest daughter is Alicia Pollock, and my daughter's name at that time was Amanda Pollock.
And do you know what year this was taken?
Yeah, 1970? How old were they? Yeah, probably. They were, let's see, 1969, 20 years old. So 60, 80, probably 89, something like that.
In Austria?
In Austria. No, in Austria. In Vienna, Austria, yes.
Thank you. I get the 3, 2, 1.
3, 2, 1.
We're looking at Stoppelsteiner.
Yes.
Can you tell us about?
Yes,
About
these are
what
stones placed in Mannheim at the on behalf of victims of Nazism, Jewish victims, and near the last place where they lived in Mannheim. And there's a stone for my grandfather, Solomon Helter, his wife, my grandmother, Leah Helter, and a stone for my uncle, who died in Sachsenhausen, and a stone for my mother, who actually lived to be 94.
Did you take this picture?
Yes.
Do you remember when you took it?
Well, about 5 years ago. So what?
You were in Germany 5 years ago?
Yes.
So that would be
2019? 2019, yes. Something, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for speaking with us today and sharing these photos. And this now concludes the interview.
Well, thank you very much again for the opportunity to share my mother and father's story. Appreciate it.